One of the most significant events in American history was the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy live on TV from Dallas, Texas, where the president was mid-parade route with his wife, Jackie. 3 shots pierced through the air, striking John F. Kennedy and sent him into a slump in the back seat of the car. Viewers were horrified, but it wouldn't be until 1969 when rumors of a Kennedy family curse would spread, as more members of the Kennedy family were brutally killed or died from tragic, uncanny accidents. And the assassination of President JFK certainly wasn't the first time the Kennedy family curse had struck. In fact, public perception of the so-called curse spread and spanned over 60 years of generations in the Kennedy family. On today's episode of the Conspiracy Files, we're going to explore the series of unfortunate events surrounding the famous Kennedy clan. From murders, accidental deaths, tragic misfortunes, and even a supposed lobotomy. Is the Kennedy family actually cursed, or did they just have a long-running history of bad luck? As always, all parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. All opinions on today's show are solely mine, Colin Browen, the host and producer of The Conspiracy Files. I want to thank Rebecca Whitworth for writing today's script, and without further ado, let's hop right on in. So, first of all, I know that I missed all of this by a couple of weeks. I know Women's History Month was in March. It's now April when I'm recording this. I don't know when this episode's going to air. But everybody who's watching / listening, I just want you all to please show some love to the amazing women who are helping to make this show possible. Every writer that is hired on the show, every researcher, they are all women. And without them, this show wouldn't be here. So I just want to say thank you to all the wonderful women behind the scenes. And in the comment section, or if you're viewing or listening to this show and you're a woman, just know that there is a space for you in this community. I know that conspiracies and sort of, shows like this can feel very male-centered sometimes, but to all the women out there who comment all the time and who watch the show, I appreciate you all so much. And yeah, just a big thank you to everybody before we hop in here. And today's script is brought to you by Rebecca Whitworth, who did a lot of the research and writing here. She's absolutely incredible. This story is just crazy. Obviously, everybody knows JFK. I'm going to be doing a JFK episode soon. It's incredibly long and very thorough. And something that's always intrigued me, just as a side note about JFK, is all of the deaths surrounding JFK. It's absolutely absurd. There have been entire books. I believe one of the books is called The Hit List. I read it a while ago. I can't remember the exact title, but going through all of the witnesses and people involved who died in these bizarre ways, building fires, murders, self-unalivings. It's really crazy. So obviously that's probably the greatest cover-up of all time. At least it's the most in-your-face one, besides Epstein, I think, that we've ever seen. I think there are obviously greater cover-ups that have happened, but, we just don't really know about them, or the masses don't really understand, that these things have happened. But the Kennedy clan, once you start going past JFK and looking at all the other members of the Kennedy family, it's pretty shocking. This episode is really shocking. And so, without further ado, let's just get straight into this. The shortcomings of a Kennedy family curse were believed to have started as early as August of 1941 with Rosemary Kennedy. Rosemary was the eldest daughter born to Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. As a child, she reportedly exhibited developmental delays, such as having a hard time learning to sit up, crawl, and walk, and later with reading and writing. In her young adult years, she became increasingly irritable and difficult. It was reported that she would experience convulsions and fly into violent rages, during which she would hit and injure others. As a result, and out of fear of her embarrassing the family, her father arranged a lobotomy on her in 1941, when she was just 23 years old. In Ronald Kessler's 1996 biography of Joe Sr., Sins of the Father, James W. Watts, who carried out the procedure with Walter Freeman, described the procedure to Kessler as follows. After Rosemary was mildly sedated, quote, "We went through the top of the head," Dr. Watts recalled. "I think she was awake. She had a mild tranquilizer. I made a surgical incision in the brain through the skull. It was near the front. It was on both sides. We just made a small incision, no more than an inch." End quote. The instrument Dr. Watts used looked like a butter knife. He swung it up and down to cut brain tissue. "We put an instrument inside," he said. As Dr. Watts cut, Dr. Freeman asked Rosemary, for example, to recite the Lord's Prayer or sing God Bless America, or even count backwards. Quote, "We tried to estimate thus how far to further cut based on how Rosemary responded." End quote. and when she became incoherent, they ceased cutting. Watts told Kessler that in his opinion, Kennedy did not have mental problems, but rather a form of depression. A review of all the papers written by the two doctors confirmed Watts's declaration. All the patients that the two doctors lobotomized were diagnosed as having some form of mental disorder. Bertram S. Brown, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, who was previously an aide to President Kennedy, told Kessler that Joe Kennedy referred to his daughter Rosemary as mentally rather than mentally ill in order to protect John's reputation for a presidential run, and that the family's lack of support for mental illness is part of a lifelong family denial of what was really so. It was quickly apparent that the procedure had caused immense harm. Kennedy's mental capacity diminished to that of a 2-year-old child. She couldn't walk, she couldn't speak intelligibly, and she was incontinent, meaning she frequently wet herself. She then spent most of the rest of her life being cared for at St. Coletta, an institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin. The truth, though, about her situation and whereabouts was kept secret for decades, and it wasn't until Joseph's death in 1969 when her siblings even found out where she was. Her sister Eunice publicly revealed her condition in 1962, and this entire thing wasn't public knowledge until the year 1987 when it was publicly revealed that she had received a lobotomy. So obviously, lobotomies are a dark and disturbing part of American and, world history. The fact that so many people were given lobotomies that definitely shouldn't have had lobotomies, obviously it's an archaic procedure. And it's like putting a band-aid on a gunshot wound. It doesn't actually help. It just turned these people into, vegetable zombies. It's crazy that the Kennedy family tried to essentially cover up the fact that they had had their sister lobotomized and shipped off to a facility where she was cared for by other people. They really didn't want any association with her. So that's dark. That's really dark. But that's just the very beginning. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., the oldest child of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, was an American naval aviator who served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. Joseph's father had aspirations for him to become President of the United States, like his younger brother John later became. And in 1940, he became a delegate to the Democratic National Convention, planning to run for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives after his military service as the first stepping stone on the path to presidency. In 1944, Joseph Kennedy was part of the Operation Aphrodite, which was the use of Army Air Corps Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and Navy Consolidated PB-4Y-1 Liberator bombers that were converted into flying bombs and deliberately crashed into their targets under radio control from an accompanying bomber. On August 12th, Joseph Kennedy and his co-pilot Willie flew a BQ-8 robot aircraft loaded with 21,170 pounds of Torpex explosives and took off to be used against a suspected V-3 development site at Mimoyequis. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that name. As planned, Joseph Kennedy and Willie remained aboard that aircraft as the BQ-8 completed its first remote-controlled turn at 2,000 feet near the North Sea coast. Then, Joseph Kennedy and Willie removed the safety pin, arming the explosive package, and Joseph radioed the agreed code, Spade Flush, his last known words. 2 minutes later, and well before the planned crew bailout near RAF Manston in Kent, the explosives on Kennedy's plane detonated prematurely, destroying the Liberator and instantly killing Joseph Kennedy and Willie. The combat camera unit on a neighboring aircraft supposedly filmed the whole incident, but that footage was never found. Drone operations were then paused for a month while equipment was evaluated and modified, and it was later suspected that jamming or a stray signal could have armed and detonated the explosives. Later reports stated that Joseph's final mission had been kept top secret until years later, and eventually, in 1945, a detailed public account of the operation and of Joseph Kennedy's death was released. Up until his death, Joseph was dating Athalia Ponzo Lindsley, an American model, Broadway dancer, political activist, and television personality, who was later on found murdered on the front steps of her home in St. Augustine, Florida in 1974. Neighbor Alan Griffin Stanford Jr., with whom she had an ongoing feud at the time, was initially charged with her murder, but he was ultimately acquitted, and her murder remains unsolved to this very day. So you have Joseph Kennedy dying in a massive plane explosion, completely random, and then years later, his longtime girlfriend, who he was in a relationship with up until his death, she's whacked on the front steps of her house, and the murder is still unsolved. Like I said, this is just the very beginning. There's also Kathleen Kick Kennedy. Kathleen was the second daughter of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald, sister to John F. Kennedy and Senators Robert F. Kennedy and Ted Kennedy. and wife of the Marquess of Hartington, heir apparent to the 10th Duke of Devonshire. While her family was serving as U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, Kathleen Kennedy made many friends in London and was the, quote, debutante of 1938. Working with the Red Cross, she began a romantic relationship with Lord Hartington, whom she married in May of 1944, despite her mother's objections. Lord Hartington and Kathleen spent less than 5 weeks together before he went off to fight the war in France. 4 months after their marriage, and less than a month after Joe Jr. was killed, Hartington was killed by a sniper during a battle with the Germans in Belgium, and with his family's blessing, he was buried close to the area in which he fell. Eventually, after she was widowed, Lady Hartington, aka Kennedy, became romantically involved with the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam. And once again, her mother disapproved of this and warned Kathleen that she would be disowned and cut off financially if she married this man. In 1948, Kathleen learned that her father would be traveling to Paris, and so, in an effort to gain his consent for her upcoming plans to marry Fitzwilliam, she decided to fly to Paris to meet with her father. On May 13, 1948, Kathleen Kennedy and Lord Fitzwilliam were flying from Paris to the French Riviera for a vacation. At 3:30 in the afternoon, their plane took off and eventually reached an altitude of 10,000 feet. However, approximately 1 hour into the flight, radio contact was lost with the plane when it entered the region near Vienne. The plane's 4 occupants endured 20 minutes of severe turbulence, which bounced their small plane up and down as much as several thousand feet at a time. And when they finally cleared the clouds, they instantly discovered the plane was in a dive and moments away from impact, and they attempted to pull up. However, the stress of the turbulence, coupled with the sudden change in direction, tore loose one of the wings, followed by both engines, and finally the tail of the plane. The plane's fuselage then spun into the ground seconds later, coming to rest nose down in a ravine after striking terrain at Plateau de Coron. Kathleen Kennedy was killed instantly, along with Fitzwilliam, the pilot Peter Townsend, and the navigator Arthur Freeman. Kathleen was buried on the Cavendish family burial grounds at St. Peter's Churchyard, Edinburgh, outside of Chatsworth, Derbyshire, England. Her father was the only family member to attend the funeral, arranged by the Devonshires. Rose Kennedy had refused to attend her daughter's funeral and instead entered a hospital for medical reasons. So bizarre, right? Months away from each other in that same time period, 2 original kind of Kennedy clan family members die in plane-related accidents. There's this one plane that basically disintegrates in mid-air, mid-flight after this turbulence. Then you have another, Kennedy who's fighting in the war, whose explosives detonate, preemptively killing him. And it gets weirder and weirder from there. Because at this point, John and Jackie Kennedy are getting married, they're starting to have kids, and we have to get to John F. Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy's first daughter. On August 23, 1956, John and Jackie Kennedy's first daughter was tragically stillborn after Jackie awoke to heavy bleeding and was taken to the hospital. Her daughter was later delivered by C-section at the Newport Hospital Emergency Department in Rhode Island. At the time, John F. Kennedy was cruising the Mediterranean on a yacht and was reportedly reluctant to return home. However, his friend told him to, quote, haul his ass back to his wife if he ever wanted to run for president, end quote, and so he did. The couple never officially named their stillborn girl, but Jackie later referred to her as Arabella. Before Arabella, Jackie Kennedy had suffered a miscarriage in 1955, just 3 months into her pregnancy. Arabella, that stillborn baby, was buried in a local Catholic cemetery in Rhode Island, but was later reinterred beside her father at Arlington National Cemetery. Her headstone at Arlington simply reads, daughter, as Jackie reportedly didn't want to mark her stillborn daughter's grave with an informal nickname that her husband may not have even been aware of. Moving on though, we have to talk about Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. On the morning of Wednesday, August 7th, 1963, while Jackie Kennedy and her 2 children, Caroline and John Jr., were in Massachusetts, Jackie began to feel early labor pains. John, at the White House at the time, boarded Air Force One, while the infant Kennedy was born by C-section at 12:52 p.m. at the Otis Air Force Base Hospital in Bourne, Massachusetts, 5.5 weeks prematurely. The infant's birth weight was 4 pounds, 10.5 ounces. He was the first child born to a serving U.S. president and first lady since the 19th century. Shortly after birth, though, sadly, Patrick developed symptoms of hyaline membrane disease, now called infant respiratory distress syndrome, and this was detected by breathing difficulties within minutes of being born. The president then arrived, saw his son in distress, and sent for a chaplain. The infant was quickly baptized, named Patrick after his great-grandfather, and Bouvier after his mother's maiden name. While he was there, the president was allowed to wheel the baby in an incubator to the First Lady's bedside. James E. Jorbot, the pediatric specialist of Boston Children's Hospital, was flown by helicopter from Boston to consult on his case, and he recommended transfer to Boston. 5 hours after birth, the infant, accompanied by Dr. Jorbot, was rushed by ambulance to Boston Children's Hospital, 70 miles away, in under 90 minutes. The transfer to the hospital in Boston was initially reported as a precautionary measure, the White House said. The baby's condition was accurately reported as HMD, but it was also reported that it would take at least 4 days to assess his condition and that he was being given medication to assist his condition. Led by Dr. Jorbot, who stayed awake the entire time, the hospital tried everything possible to save the infant's life. The baby was given hyperbaric oxygen therapy, in which he was placed in a hyperbaric chamber filled with 100% oxygen and pressurized to greater than 1 atmosphere. At the time, the treatment was revolutionary, but unfortunately, Patrick died at 4:04 a.m. on August 9th, despite a desperate medical effort to save him, and had lived 39 hours and 12 minutes. At the time of the infant's death, the president was outside the hyperbaric chamber with his brother, U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. The First Lady, then 34, then remained at Otis Air Force Base Hospital, recovering from the C-section. She was told of her son's death by Dr. Walsh. She was also given a sedative, and she went to sleep until John F. Kennedy flew in to see her from Boston. The New York Times obituary included the following information.
His obituary in the New York Times stated that, at the time, all that could be done for a victim of hyaline membrane disease is to monitor the infant's blood chemistry and to try to keep it near normal levels.
Very little was said about the family's reaction. White House Press Secretary Pierre Salinger stated of the First Lady's condition, "Given the circumstances, her condition is satisfactory." The president, who had reportedly slept only 4 hours since the birth, was photographed arriving at Otis Air Force Base looking grave and appearing tired. A small funeral mass was held on August 10, 1963, in the private chapel of Cardinal Richard Cushing in Boston. The president's mother, Rose Kennedy, was in Paris and was told not to return for the funeral, but the First Lady's sister, Lee Radziwill, had already flown in from Greece before the baby died. Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston, performed the funeral mass. Siblings Caroline, then 5 years old, and John Jr., just 2.5, did not attend. The child was initially buried at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts, the president's hometown. But later, his body and that of his stillborn sister Arabella were dug up and reinterred on December 5, 1963, alongside their father at Arlington National Cemetery, and later moved to their permanent graves in Section 45, Grid U35 in the same cemetery. And now we're back to one of the most significant deaths in the Kennedy family, U.S. President John F. Kennedy, shown in this clip.
On January 2, 1960, Kennedy initiated his campaign for president in the Democratic primary election, where he faced challenges from Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota and Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon. Kennedy defeated Humphrey in Wisconsin and West Virginia, Morse in Maryland and Oregon. His victory in West Virginia confirmed his broad popular appeal. At the Democratic convention, he gave his well-known New Frontier speech, saying, "For the problems are not all solved, and the battles are not all won, and we stand today on the edge of a new frontier."
John F. Kennedy was the 35th acting president of the United States, and not only is he part of this curse, his assassination has obviously fueled numerous conspiracy theories on exactly what happened. On November 22nd, 1963, just over 3 months since Patrick Kennedy's birth and death, John F. Kennedy, the 35th president of the United States, was assassinated while riding in a presidential motorcade in Dallas, Texas, as explained by this clip.
The motorcade cars had been lined up in a certain order earlier that morning. The original schedule was for the president to proceed in a long motorcade from Love Field through downtown Dallas and end at the Dallas Business and Trade Mart. The original scheduled route had the motorcade continue straight onto Main instead of turning onto Houston, but it was discovered that Elm Street provided the only direct link from Dealey Plaza to the Stemmons Freeway. Thus, the route was altered. The presidential motorcade began its route without incident. stopping twice so President Kennedy could shake hands with some Catholic nuns.
At 12:30 p.m., John F. Kennedy was in the vehicle with his wife Jackie, Texas Governor John Connally, and Connally's wife Nellie as their limousine entered Dealey Plaza in Dallas. At one point, Nellie turned and commented to John, who was sitting behind her, "Mr. President, they can't make you believe now that there are not some in Dallas who love and appreciate you, can they?" Kennedy replied, "No, they sure can't." Those were his last words. From Houston Street, the limousine made the planned left turn onto Elm, passing the Texas School Book Depository, and as it continued down Elm Street, multiple shots were fired. About 80% of the witnesses recalled hearing 3 shots. According to the Warren Commission, obviously very crooked commission, and the HSCA, Kennedy was waving to the crowds on his right when a shot entered his upper back and exited his throat just beneath his larynx. He raised his eyebrows and clenched his fists in front of his face and neck, then leaned forward and leftward. Jackie put her arms around him, and it was reported that although it was a serious wound, it likely would have been survivable. But as the limousine passed the infamous grassy knoll, John F. Kennedy was struck a second time by a fatal shot to the rear of his head. It then passed in fragments through his skull, creating a large ovular hole on the rear right side of the head, and blood and bone fragments everywhere. John F. Kennedy's sprayed far behind the vehicle, even hitting the Secret Service car that was following his motorcade, and even some of the motorcycle officers that were riding immediately behind the limousine. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who was one of those men on the motorcycles behind Kennedy's limousine, testified to the Warren Commission that he heard one shot, jumped onto the street, and ran forward to board the limousine and protect Kennedy. Hill stated that he heard the fatal headshot as he reached the Lincoln, approximately 5 seconds after the first shot that he heard. After the headshot, Jackie began climbing onto the limousine's trunk, but she later had no recollection of doing so. Hill believed that she may have been reaching for a piece of her husband's skull. So Hill jumped onto the limousine's bumper and clung to the car as it exited Dealey Plaza and sped to Parkland Memorial Hospital. After Jackie had crawled back into her seat, both the governor and Mrs. Connally heard her repeatedly saying, "They've killed my husband. I have his in my hand." At 12:38 p.m., President Kennedy arrived in the ER of the emergency room of Parkland Memorial Hospital. Although Kennedy was still breathing after the shooting, his personal physician, George Berkeley, immediately saw that survival was impossible. After Parkland surgeons performed futile CPR, President Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1:00 p.m., 30 minutes after the shooting. They broke the news on live television, which you're about to see in the following clip. Please note that this clip at times can be extremely graphic, so watch at your own risk.
The essential facts are these. President Kennedy was murdered in Dallas, Texas. He was shot by a sniper hiding in a building near his parade route.
The Secret Service was immediately concerned about the possibility of a larger plot, and they urged Lyndon B. Johnson to leave Dallas, to which he replied he would not leave with Jackie Kennedy, and she would not leave without John F. Kennedy's body. At the time of the Kennedy assassination, the murder of a president was not under federal jurisdiction. Accordingly, Dallas County Medical Examiner Earl Rose insisted that Texas law required him to perform an autopsy. A heated exchange between Kennedy's aides and Dallas officials nearly erupted into a fistfight before the Texans yielded and allowed Kennedy's body to be transported to Air Force One. President Kennedy's autopsy was performed on November 22nd, and people argue that it was the most botched segment of the government investigation. First, the physicians conducted a rushed and incomplete autopsy. Then, 3 years after the autopsy, John F. Kennedy's brain was found to be missing when the family transferred material to the National Archives. Also, some autopsy x-rays and photographs were lost to time, meaning they just vanished. Following the autopsy, Kennedy lay in repose, as explained in this documentary clip.
The body of President Kennedy was brought back to Washington, D.C. and placed in the East Room of the White House for 24 hours. Vice President Johnson took the oath as president on board that flight.
The state funeral was held in Washington, D.C., as shown in the following.
The state funeral of John F. Kennedy took place in Washington, D.C. during the 3 days that followed his assassination. On the Sunday, his coffin was carried on a horse-drawn caisson to the U.S. Capitol to lie in state. Throughout the day and night, hundreds of thousands lined up to view the guarded casket. Representatives from over 90 countries attended the state funeral on Monday, November 25. The widow, wearing a black veil and holding the hands of her 2 children, John Jr., who celebrated his 3rd birthday, on the day of his father's funeral, and Caroline led the way up the steps of the cathedral. The 3-year-old John Jr. stoically saluted his father's casket during live television coverage of the funeral procession.
After the service, Kennedy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, where an eternal flame was lit in 1967. Now, we are going to dive deep into JFK's murder, the plot to have him killed, all the bad actors involved, all the people that got away with it, obviously Lee Harvey Oswald being a patsy and a fall guy, and we're going to go incredibly deep into that whole thing. I have a 63-page script written, which is going to be very, very long. So we're going to save all that talk for another time, because right now we're just focused on the Kennedys. But subscribe and stay tuned for that episode, because we're going to go really, really in depth. Because now we have to get to U.S. Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Robert Francis Kennedy was an American politician and lawyer who served as the 64th United States Attorney General from January 1961 to September 1964. He also served as a U.S. Senator from New York from January 1965 until June 1968, when he was running for the Democratic presidential nomination. Like his brothers, John F. Kennedy and Ted Kennedy, he was a prominent member of the Democratic Party and is considered an icon of modern American liberalism. On June 4th, 1965, after Robert Kennedy won the California and South Dakota primaries, he was addressing his campaign supporters in the Ambassador Hotel's Embassy Ballroom in California, as explained here.
At the time, the government provided Secret Service protection for incumbent presidents, but not for presidential candidates. Kennedy's only security was provided by former FBI agent William Barry and 2 unofficial bodyguards, former professional athletes. During the campaign, Kennedy had welcomed contact with the public, and people had often tried to touch him in their excitement. Kennedy had planned to walk through the ballroom when he had finished speaking, on his way to another gathering of supporters elsewhere in the hotel. However, with deadlines fast approaching, reporters wanted a press conference. Campaign aide Fred Dutton decided that Kennedy would forgo the second gathering and instead go through the kitchen and pantry area behind the ballroom to the press area.
At this point, Robert started to exit through the ballroom when former FBI agent William Barry directed Robert to the left, through some swinging doors into the kitchen corridor. Maitre d'hotel Carl Uecker led Robert through the kitchen area, holding his right wrist, but frequently releasing it as Robert shook hands with people whom he encountered. When Uecker and Kennedy started down a passageway narrowed by an ice machine and a steam table to the north, Robert turned to his left and shook hands with a man named Juan Romero. Just as Saoirse stepped down from a low tray stacker beside the ice machine, rushed past Uecker, and repeatedly fired an 8-shot .22 long rifle caliber revolver at point-blank range right into Robert Kennedy's body. Robert Kennedy then fell to the floor as writer George Plimpton and another tried to disarm Sirhan, but he continued firing his gun in random directions. Robert Kennedy had been shot multiple times. The fatal shot was fired at a range of 1 inch and entered behind his right ear. The other 2 shots entered at the rear of his right armpit, one exiting his chest and the other lodged in the back of his neck. Barry attended to him on the ground.
Barry went to Kennedy and laid his jacket under the candidate's head, later recalling, "I knew immediately it was a .22, a small caliber, so I hoped it wouldn't be so bad. But then I saw the hole in the senator's, and I knew."
Romero cradled his head and placed a rosary in his hand. Kennedy's wife, Ethel, who was 3 months pregnant, had been away from the shooting scene at the time that it happened. She was led to Kennedy and knelt beside him. He turned his head, seeming to recognize her, and after a few minutes, medical attendants arrived and lifted Kennedy onto a stretcher, prompting him to whisper, "Don't leave me," which were his last words. He lost consciousness shortly afterwards before the following occurred.
One doctor slapped his face, calling "Bob, Bob," while another massaged Kennedy's heart. After obtaining a good heartbeat, doctors handed a stethoscope to Ethel Kennedy so she could hear her husband's heart beating, much to her relief.
After obtaining a good heartbeat, Robert Kennedy was transferred several blocks to Good Samaritan Hospital to undergo surgery. Surgery began at 3:12 a.m. and lasted approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes. At 5:30 p.m. on Wednesday, spokesman Frank Mankiewicz announced that Kennedy's doctors were concerned over his continuing failure to show improvement. His condition was critical. Despite extensive neurosurgery to remove the bullet and bone fragments from his brain, he was pronounced dead at 1:44 a.m. on June 6th, nearly 25 hours after the shooting. At 2 a.m. on June 6th, spokesman Frank announced Kennedy's death to the press and news media.
Here at the Ambassador Hotel, Los Angeles, at the moment of his greatest political triumph. Bobby Kennedy, too, had been gunned down. For 25 hours, he clung to life at the Good Samaritan Hospital. A bullet lodged in his brain. Surgeons fought to save him. Waiting crowds prayed. Their prayers echoed throughout the United States, throughout the world. It was unbelievable that such a tragedy could happen twice in the same family. Jackie Kennedy, sister-in-law, widow of the late president, arrived to join the family's bedside vigil. She knew so well the horror of this moment.
On the morning of June 8th, Senator Kennedy's casket was taken to St. Patrick's Cathedral, where it was viewed by thousands, later followed by the funeral mass. Kennedy was buried near JFK in Arlington National Cemetery, the first burial to ever have taken place there at night. But the curse doesn't end there. We now have to talk about David A. Kennedy. David Anthony Kennedy in Washington, D.C. was the fourth of 11 children born to Senator Robert F. Kennedy and Ethel Skokel Kennedy. David A. Kennedy had been just 12 years old when he was at the Ambassador Hotel in June of 1968, watching news footage of his father's assassination, which had happened downstairs with his brother, RFK Jr. He was supposed to be asleep at the time, but the excitement of the day had kept him awake. So some time had elapsed before someone came to check on him. Presidential biographer Theodore White found the boy devastated at the sight he had seen and comforted the youngster. He supposedly was extremely emotionally attached to his father. According to the Palm Beach Post, family members said that assassination triggered David's addiction to which started at the age of 13, but a car crash in 1973 likely made it worse. In 1973, David was involved in a very serious Jeep accident in which his brother, Joseph Patrick Kennedy II, was driving. David sustained a major fracture, and his girlfriend, Pamela Kelly, was left paralyzed. David then became addicted to the painkillers he was prescribed and later turned to that autumn. In February of 1973, after spending time between McKean, Virginia and New York City, David decided to move to New York full-time, where he was often seen in the various hotspot nightclubs of the city with a variety of attractive women. Between 1976 and 1978, he was twice diagnosed with bacterial endocarditis, an inflammation of the heart, a common result of using intravenous drugs. He also suffered from in 1976 and 1978. Between 78 and 84, David spent time at various locations trying to treat his but he went through several relapses. On April 19, 1984, David flew down to Palm Beach, Florida to be with his family for an extended Easter break at the Brazilian Court Hotel. He was there to see Rose Kennedy, whom the family thought they would be celebrating their last Easter with, and David was distraught at the state she was in. Additionally, Marion Neiman, a woman he had supposedly gone out with during his stay, stated that David had had quite a bit to drink that evening, and back at the hotel, he sobbed and talked about the night his father had died and the pain he had felt about it ever since. When the family got together for Easter at the Kennedy estate, David reportedly got thrown out because he was very dirty and very intoxicated, and so abusive to members of the family that he was removed from the function altogether. David instead went to party until the early hours of the morning and then retired to his room, and witnesses said that he had a massive amount of drinks that evening. At 10:30 a.m., Caroline Kennedy and cousin Sidney Lawford arrived at the hotel looking for David. There was no answer from his hotel room. Later, Ethel Kennedy called the receptionist asking that they check on David, and from there, Douglas Masciano and Betty Barnett, the hotel secretary, went upstairs to his room to see if everything was all right. When they entered the room, they found that the curtains were still drawn, the beds had not been slept in, there was money all over the floor, clothing scattered everywhere, and the phone was off the hook. Between the two beds, wearing a shirt, pants, shoes, and socks, was the body of David Kennedy lying face down. It was 11:32 a.m. when they found him, and he appeared to have been dead for quite some time. The news at the time reported the following.
The family whose tragedies our country has followed and indeed felt has been struck once again. Today, David Kennedy, found dead in a Palm Beach, Florida hotel room. Although Kennedy had a history of police would not positively confirm that caused his death. They would say only there was no sign of foul play. The drug problem of Ethel and Robert's fourth child dates back at least to 1979, when police say Kennedy frequented a connection in Harlem. At the time, friends of the Harvard student called Kennedy one of the walking wounded, saying young David admitted to her. That's a habit David shared with his older brother Robert, who's now on probation after a recent possession conviction. It's also a problem the family tried to deal with by hiring private live-in drug counselors, though in this case, to no avail. Today, a phone call by the mother of Robert Kennedy's 11 children prompted the search of her son's hotel room. This morning, in that room, just after 11:30, David Kennedy was pronounced dead. Ironically, it was also in a hotel room back in 1968 that David Kennedy learned from a television news crew of the death of his father. In Miami, Diane Magnum, Channel 10, Eyewitness News.
An autopsy determined that he had died on April 25th following an combined with the tranquilizer and the painkiller. A funeral service was held in Brookline, Massachusetts, where he was then afterwards buried at the family plot. But an investigation indicated several suspicious things regarding David's death. At first, it was believed that no drugs were found, but police later reported that they had found 1.3 grams of hidden in David's wallet in the drawer. Traces of the drugs were found in the toilet bowls and tank, and people considered this odd, as a drug would likely never flush their down the toilet. Someone had been in the room and apparently had cleaned up, but they missed the drugs in his wallet. Additionally, there were no syringes found in the room. And furthermore, apparently according to the official story, David had into his groin and had a sock inside out, which indicated he may have been found nude originally and was later dressed after he died. Why would someone who had drank an exorbitant amount of alcohol after in the groin bothered to put all of his clothes back on in the state that he was in at the time? Defense attorneys at the trial demanded that the fingerprints they found of David's be tested against other Kennedys, but the prosecutors refused this. Later, police said that the fingerprints did not belong to Caroline or Sydney, but they hadn't identified them all, and 2 of the cousins' fingerprints were never even taken in the first place. Additionally, none of the Kennedys were ever seriously interviewed, and over 1,000 pages were never released, including the final toxicology report. The investigation ended with 2 bellhops being arrested for selling to David, and that was it. Kind of suspicious, right? He's embarrassing the family. He's kicked out of the family function. This is one of the most famous families in America. The guy has for years been struggling, embarrassing them, on a national stage, and then he ends up dead with suspicious circumstances surrounding his death. The day, or I guess I should say the night/early morning after he had this blowout fight with the entire family where they felt he was disrespecting them, and they actually kicked him out of the family celebration. But it just keeps on going. There's also Michael LeMoyne Kennedy, who was the 6th of 11 children of Robert F. Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy. He was 5 years old when his uncle JFK was assassinated, and 10 years old when his father RFK was assassinated. A Boston lawyer, Michael Kennedy briefly worked for a private law firm before becoming chairman of his brother Joseph's nonprofit organization, Citizens Energy Corporation, in 1986, which provides heating oil and services to the elderly and low-income households in Massachusetts. Under Kennedy, Citizens diversified to provide discount AIDS-related medications to uninsured patients. In 1997, allegations were reported that Michael Kennedy was having an affair with the family's underage former babysitter, an affair which allegedly began when she was only 14 years old. Michael Kennedy took and passed 3 polygraph tests arranged by his attorneys, during which he claimed he had not had sex with the Cohasset teen until she was 16, the legal age of consent in Massachusetts at the time, despite news reports like this one.
There was some good news for Michael Kennedy this week when the parents of the teenage babysitter with whom he had a 5-year affair decided not to pursue criminal charges. However, a lawyer for the babysitter's family called Kennedy a, quote, sick, pathetic individual, while the county district attorney described him as a, quote, alcoholic cradle robber. The only kind words came from his uncle, Senator Ted Kennedy, who called him, quote, an inspiration.
Soon after the scandal began, Kennedy and his wife separated. Norfolk County District Attorney Jeffrey Locke decided to drop the investigation into statutory because of a lack of cooperation from the babysitter. Michael Kennedy and his older brother Joseph, who withdrew from the 1998 Massachusetts gubernatorial election in part because of this scandal, were dubbed poster boys for bad behavior by cousin John F. Kennedy Jr. in an editorial in his magazine, George. According to some Massachusetts political observers, this incident ended Kennedy's hopes of following in his family's political footsteps. Michael Kennedy died on December 31st, 1997 as the result of a skiing accident in Aspen, Colorado. He was playing football while on skis with several other members of the Kennedy family when, at approximately 4:15 p.m., he hit a tree going a fast speed. Kennedy was not wearing a helmet or any other safety equipment at the time. In fact, The family had been admonished earlier that day by the ski patrol to cease the activity, to stop playing football at high speeds with no safety equipment on the mountain. After the accident, Michael Kennedy was taken to Aspen Valley Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 5:50 p.m. He was later interred on January 3rd, 1998 in the family plot at Brookline, Massachusetts. There's also John F. Kennedy Jr. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. was the second born of U.S. President John F. Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. Born 2 weeks after his father was elected president, JFK Jr. spent his early childhood years living in the White House until his father was assassinated. At the funeral procession, which took place on his 3rd birthday, JFK Jr. gave his father's flag-draped casket a final salute as it went past him. As an adult, Kennedy was a popular social figure in Manhattan and the subject of intense media attention throughout his entire life. He worked for nearly 4 years as an assistant district attorney in New York City, and in 1995, he launched the magazine George with Michael Berman, using his political and celebrity status to promote it. The September 1997 issue of George featured Kennedy's cousins, Michael LeMoyne Kennedy and Joseph P. Kennedy II, as Michael had been accused of having an affair with his children's underage babysitter, while Joseph, a Massachusetts congressman, had been accused by his ex-wife of having bullied her. On September 21st, 1996, Kennedy married Carolyn Bessette in Cumberland Island, Georgia, but the pair struggled over the next few years due to the intense media attention. In April 1998, John F. Kennedy Jr. took flying lessons at the Flight Safety Academy in Vero Beach, Florida, where he later received his pilot's license. Then on July 16, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. departed from Fairfield, New Jersey at the control of his aircraft. He was traveling with his wife and sister-in-law, Lauren Bessette. Lauren was going to be dropped off at Martha's Vineyard, and John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife would continue on to Hyannisport, Massachusetts to attend the wedding of his cousin, Rory Kennedy. John F. Kennedy Jr. that day had already checked in with the control tower at the Martha's Vineyard Airport, but shortly afterwards, the plane was reported missing after it failed to arrive on schedule. Officials were not hopeful about finding survivors after aircraft debris and a black suitcase belonging to Bessette were recovered shortly afterwards from the Atlantic Ocean. On July 18th, a Coast Guard admiral declared an end to the rescue efforts, and within the next 2 days, news reports informed the masses of the details.
John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife and her sister took off from Caldwell, New Jersey, a small place not far from New York City, about 8:30 Eastern Time last night. While no flight plan was filed, none had to be under the circumstances of this flight. They were bound for Martha's Vineyard. The plane was due there about 10 o'clock, never got there. Radar contact is believed to have been made just after 9:30, believed to have been made about 17 miles west of Martha's Vineyard in that Gay Head area, and the aircraft was believed at that time to be down to about 2,000 feet. Footnote, bottom of the page, reminding again that there are 2 eye and ear witnesses who say that they saw and heard a small plane 20 to 50 or 60 feet off the water at about that time. That is 9:30 to 9:45. The plane is now 19 hours overdue. No sign of the aircraft, no sign of the people who were aboard the plane. There were some early unconfirmed reports of a beep possibly coming from some emergency beacon. It was never confirmed. The Coast Guard checked it out, no later word. And so at this point, the belief runs strong that there has been no emergency signal of any kind received from the aircraft, now 19 hours overdue. And if you're asking yourself the question, well, did they ever contact Martha's Vineyard Airport Tower? The answer is no, there was no contact there.
After the fragments of Kennedy's plane were found by NOAA vessel Rude using side-scan sonar, Navy divers were subsequently prompted to descend into the 62-degree water. They found a part of the shattered plane strewn over a broad area of seabed 120 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, and the search ended in the late afternoon of July 21st when high-resolution images of the ocean bottom helped Navy divers recover the 3 bodies from the ocean floor. The bodies were taken by motorcade to the county medical examiner's office afterwards, and divers found Carolyn and Lauren's bodies near the twisted and broken fuselage, while John F. Kennedy Jr.'s body was still strapped in to the pilot's seat. Admiral Richard M. Larrabee of the Coast Guard said that all 3 bodies were near and under the fuselage and still strapped in. The National Transportation Safety Board determined that pilot error was the probable cause of the crash. Kennedy's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which was a result of spatial disorientation. That was the given reason for why the plane crashed. Later that evening, the bodies were autopsied at the county medical examiner's office and taken from Hyannis to Duxbury, where they were cremated in the Mayflower Flower Cemetery crematorium. The families announced their plans for memorial services that same day, and the autopsy determined that the crash victims had died upon impact. Kennedy favored a public service for John, while Caroline Kennedy insisted on family privacy. On the morning of July 22nd, their ashes were scattered at sea from the Navy destroyer USS Briscoe off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. A memorial service was held for Kennedy on July 23, 1999, at the Church of St. Thomas More in New York City, a parish that Kennedy had often attended with his mother and sister. Hey everybody. By the way, my wife Courtney just brought our little puppy in. Everybody online, say hi to Elfie. Elfie, say hi. Nothing like a little puppy break in the middle of like a really dark, disturbing episode. Bye. Bye. So you had another plane crash, another Kennedy family member dying in an incredibly bizarre way. I mean, think about it. Everything from suspicious deaths to assassinations, plane crashes, explosions, and it just keeps getting weirder because we still have to talk about more. There's also Cara Kennedy. Cara Kennedy was the oldest of the 3 children and was the only daughter of U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts and Joan Bennett Kennedy. She was born on February 27, 1960, and was a niece to Robert F. Kennedy and John F. Kennedy. She served on boards of numerous charities such as the JFK Library Foundation and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. She was also a filmmaker and a television producer. On September 9, 1990, Cara and Michael Allen, an architect and real estate developer from Rhode Island, were married at Our Lady of Victory Church in Centerville, Massachusetts, a frequent site of Kennedy family events. They later had 2 children, Grace Kennedy Allen and Max Greathouse Allen, and after 11 years of marriage, they divorced. In 2002, Cara Kennedy was diagnosed with lung cancer, which she was told was inoperable. However, she found, with her father's help, a surgeon in Boston who was willing to remove part of her right lung in an effort to save her life. The operation ended up being successful, and she resumed an active life that included regular running and swimming. On August 12, 2009, Kennedy accepted the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama on behalf of her father at a ceremony in Washington, D.C. Her father died 13 days later. He had been diagnosed with brain cancer in May of 2008. In April 2011, Cara Kennedy wrote an article for the Boston Globe magazine about her family life growing up and her father's influence on her. In the article, she revealed her close relationship with her father and the role he played in helping her to wage her battle against lung cancer. On September 16, 2011, 2 years after her father's death, Kennedy suffered a fatal heart attack in a Washington, D.C. health club after her daily workout. She was 51 years old at the time. News reports at the time covered her death just like this.
Cara Kennedy, the daughter of late Senator Edward Kennedy, passed away of an apparent heart attack. She was also the sister of former Rhode Island Congressman Patrick Kennedy. She was 51 years old. And tonight we're hearing from friends of the Kennedy family about Cara's full life.
It's another tragic death for a family with a tragic history. We talked to U.S. Congressman Jim Langevin about the death of Cara Kennedy. The news was unexpected. Cara Kennedy, the sister of former Rhode Island Congressman Patrick Kennedy, died at the age of 51 from a heart attack.
Well, my thoughts and prayers go out to the entire Kennedy family. Cara's passing is such a tragic loss at such a young age, only 51 years old.
She was later interred at the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts, alongside her paternal grandparents, Rose and Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. Mary Richardson Kennedy, now a different Kennedy, another Kennedy, was an American interior designer and philanthropist. She additionally was a proponent of green building and was a co-founder of the Food Allergy Initiative, the largest fund for food allergy research in the United States. On April 15, 1994, Richardson married Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the brother of her close friend, Cara Kennedy, aboard a research vessel on the Hudson River. They had 4 children, Connor, Kira, Aiden, and William. However, during their marriage, RFK Jr. was widely regarded as a serial philanderer and was known amongst his friends for sending explicit nude photos of women that they presumed he had taken himself, according to Vanity Fair. The highly publicized allegations against RFK Jr. by the family's then babysitter, Eliza Cooney. On May 12, 2010, Kennedy filed for divorce from Richardson. 3 days later, she was arrested and charged with driving under the influence. A court then ordered that full temporary custody of her children be granted to her estranged husband. And on May 6, 2012, about 2 years later, Mary Richardson Kennedy was found dead at her home in Bedford, New York. Her death was ruled a self-unaliving. An autopsy revealed that she had antidepressants in her blood. Check this clip out.
It was a new shock for the Kennedy family on Wednesday as the estranged wife of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was found dead. Mary Richardson Kennedy was 52 and was known to have problems. It's found on Wednesday on the family estate north of New York City. Mary Kennedy's husband was the son of Robert F. Kennedy, the senator who was assassinated while running for president in 1968. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s chief of staff released a statement saying Mary Kennedy inspired our family with her kindness, her love, her gentle soul, and generous spirit. Mary Kennedy was a designer and often won praise for incorporating environmental technology into her work. Robert Kennedy filed for divorce from her in 2010. Cause of Mary Kennedy's death has not been released. An autopsy is scheduled for Thursday.
Before her death, Mary Richardson had discovered RFK Jr.'s personal journal from 2001, in which he recorded encounters with 37 different women. According to RFK Jr., Mary Richardson passed the journal along to her sisters with instructions that if anything happened to her, it should be published in the press. Her funeral was organized by the Kennedy family and was held at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Bedford. On May 21, 2012, a memorial service organized by the Richardson family was held at the Standard Hotel in Manhattan. A legal battle between her widower and her brother ensued over which family should have control of her remains. RFK Jr. won the court case and buried her beside his aunt, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, at St. Francis Xavier Cemetery in Centerville, Massachusetts. Several days later, RFK Jr. moved Richardson's remains to an empty plot in the cemetery and put up a gravestone there. Media at the time reported that Kennedy negotiated to buy 50 plots surrounding Richardson's grave, and this was confirmed when Saoirse Kennedy Hill, Mary's niece, was interred beside her in 2019. Saoirse Kennedy Hill was born on May 22, 1997, to Courtney Kennedy Hill and Paul Michael Hill. Her grandfather was Robert F. Kennedy, and her great-grandparents were Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. She graduated from Deerfield Academy, where she started the Deerfield Students Against group and later attended Boston College, where she became VP of the College Democrats. She additionally struggled with her own mental health, grappling with depression for years, saying, quote, "People talk about cancer freely. Why is it so difficult to discuss the effects of depression, bipolar, anxiety, or schizophrenic disorders? Just because the illness may not be outwardly visible doesn't mean the person suffering from it isn't struggling. Let's come together to make our community more inclusive and comfortable," end quote. On August 1st, 2019, Saoirse was found dead at Ethel Kennedy's home in Hyannisport. An autopsy determined that she had suffered from acute toxicity of and alcohol in her system. It was determined to have been an accidental. The Kennedy family was devastated by yet another tragic loss in the public eye, as reported on the news.
"We are all either struggling or know someone battling a mental health issue," Saoirse Kennedy Hill wrote, her mom's cousin calling her a loving spirit.
Her memory is going to be that of a very bright-eyed, sparkling, loving spirit. She was just doing karaoke last week and had that joy about her that was contagious. She was loved in my family.
And she was later interred to Centerville, Massachusetts, where she was buried next to Mary Richardson Kennedy. Maeve Kennedy McKenna, another woman in the Kennedy family, was born to Lieutenant Governor Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. She was a granddaughter of Senator Robert F. Kennedy and a grandniece of President JFK and First Lady Jackie Kennedy. McKean served as the executive director of the Global Health Initiative at Georgetown University. During the Obama administration, McKenna was the first ever senior advisor for human rights in the U.S. Department of State's Global AIDS Program and the Office of Global Affairs at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. However, on April 2, 2020, Maeve Kennedy McLean and her 8-year-old son, Gideon Joseph Kennedy McKean, disappeared while paddling in a canoe near McKean's mother's waterfront residence in Shadyside, Maryland. McKean had taken her family to Maryland to stay in quarantine during the COVID-19 pandemic. Reports from the Maryland Natural Resources Police indicated that they were attempting to retrieve a kickball that had landed in the water, but due to high winds, they were swept further out into the Chesapeake Bay. Fire officials from Anne Arundel County received an emergency call at 4:30 p.m. that day from a man who had spotted them near the community pier at Columbia Beach. McKean and her son were last sighted 10 miles south of Annapolis, near Herring Bay. Marine units then searched the Chesapeake Bay by boat and helicopter and eventually found an overturned canoe at around 7 p.m. on April 3, 2020, near Rockhold Creek in Dealey. Later that night, the Coast Guard suspended its search. At 7:30 p.m., Maryland officials called off the search due to darkness, and as of April 3, 2020, she and her son were presumed dead. On April 4, 2020, the search was resumed by Maryland police, and on April 6, 2020, Maeve Kennedy McKean's body was recovered. 2 days later, Gideon, her son's body, was also recovered. The medical examiner reported that McKean accidentally drowned in the turbulent and chilly waters of Chesapeake Bay. Due to the COVID pandemic, however, a public funeral could not take place. An online memorial via Zoom was hosted by the Kennedy family on April 11, 2020, and was watched by over 3,000 people. And we still have to cover Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy was the youngest of 9 children of Joseph Patrick Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. His 8 siblings were Joseph Jr., John, Rose, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, and Jean. Between the ages of 8 and 16, Ted suffered the death of his 2 siblings and his sisters failed lobotomy. After attending Harvard University and earning his law degree from the University of Virginia, Kennedy began his career as an assistant district attorney in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. He won a November 1962 special election in Massachusetts to fill the vacant seat previously held by his brother John, who had then, at that point, taken office as the President of the United States. He was then elected to a full 6-year term in 1964 and was re-elected 7 more times. He ran in 1980 in the Democratic primary campaign for the party's nomination, but lost to the incumbent president, Jimmy Carter. Kennedy played a major role in passing many laws, including the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, the National Cancer Act of 1971, the COBRA health insurance provision, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the Ryan White AIDS Care Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1991, the Mental Health Parity Act, the S-CHIP Children's Health Care Program, the No Child Left Behind Act, and the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act. On June 19, 1964, Ted Kennedy was a passenger in a private Aero Commander 680 airplane that was flying in bad weather from Washington, D.C. to Massachusetts. The plane crashed into an apple orchard in Southampton, Massachusetts, on final approach to the Barnes Municipal Airport in Westfield. The news at the time reported the incident.
Tragedy strikes again at the Kennedy family, but the blow to Senator Ted Kennedy is not fatal. The crash of his befogged plane in an apple orchard near Springfield, Massachusetts, did, however, kill his pilot and his aide. The senator's back is broken, and his guests, Senator and Mrs. Birch Bayh of Indiana, are less seriously injured. To the hospital where the 32-year-old brother of the late president is taken come members of his family, headed by Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Besides losing one brother in last November's assassination, he has also lost another brother and a sister, both in plane crashes.
Kennedy was pulled from the wreckage by fellow Senator Birch Bayh and spent months in the hospital recovering from a severe back injury, a punctured lung, broken ribs, and internal bleeding. He suffered chronic back pain for the rest of his life. On the night, though, of July 18, 1969, Ted Kennedy was at Chappaquiddick Island in Massachusetts hosting a party for the Boiler Room Girls, a group of young women who had worked on his brother Robert's presidential campaign. Kennedy, that evening, left the party with one of the women, 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne. Driving a 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont 88, he attempted to cross the nearby Dyke Bridge, which did not have a guardrail at that time. But in the middle of crossing that bridge over the ocean, Kennedy lost control of the vehicle and crashed into the Poucha Pond Inlet, a tidal channel. Ted Kennedy escaped from the overturned vehicle that had sunken into the waters below, and by his description, he dove below the surface 7 or 8 times, vainly attempting to rescue Mary Jo. Ultimately, he swam to the shore and left the scene, with Mary Jo still trapped inside of the vehicle, deep underwater. Kennedy's cousin Joe Gargan later said that he and Kennedy's friend Paul Markham, both of whom were at the party and came to the scene, had urged Ted Kennedy immediately to report it, but Ted Kennedy did not report the accident to authorities until the next morning, after 2 fishermen who were in the area happened across the submerged vehicle sitting in the water.
The following morning, 2 fishermen noticed the submerged vehicle in the water and alerted police. It was asserted by one of the rescue divers that Mary Jo had died from suffocation and not drowning or injuries sustained in the crash. Her head was facing upwards and pushed into a small pocket of air. It was estimated that she may have survived for 3 to 4 hours after the crash, and that had rescuers been called at the time of the accident, she may have survived.
A week after the incident, Ted Kennedy pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident and was given a suspended sentence of 2 months in jail. That night, he gave a national broadcast in which he said, "I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident to the police immediately," end quote. But he denied driving under the influence of alcohol and also denied any immoral conduct between him and Mary Jo. Ted Kennedy asked the Massachusetts electorate whether he should stay in office or resign. But after getting a favorable response in messages sent to him, Kennedy announced on July 30th that he would remain in the Senate and run for re-election next year. In January 1970, an inquest into Mary Jo's death was held in Edgartown, Massachusetts. At the request of the Kennedys' lawyers, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ordered the inquest to be conducted in secret. The presiding judge, James A. Boyle, concluded that some aspects of Kennedy's story of that night weren't true, and that negligent driving appears to have contributed to the death of Mary Jo. A grand jury conducted a 2-day investigation in April 1970, but issued no indictment, after which Boyle made his inquest report public. Kennedy deemed its conclusions not justified. Questions, though, about the incident generated many articles and books in the following years. And from 1979 to 2009, Ted Kennedy held various roles in office and on committees. On May 17, 2008, Ted Kennedy suffered a seizure, which was followed by a second seizure as he was being rushed from the Kennedy compound to Cape Cod Hospital, and then by helicopter to Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Within days, doctors announced that Ted Kennedy had a malignant glioma, a type of brain tumor. Doctors initially informed Ted that the tumor was inoperable, but Ted followed standard procedure and sought other opinions. He decided to follow the most aggressive course of treatment possible. On June 2, 2008, Ted Kennedy underwent brain surgery at Duke University Medical Center in an attempt to remove as much of the tumor as possible. The 3.5-hour operation, conducted by Dr. Alan Friedman while Kennedy was conscious, was deemed successful. Kennedy left the hospital a week later to begin a course of chemotherapy and radiation treatment. Opinions varied regarding Kennedy's prognosis. The surgery typically extends survival time for only a few months, but people can sometimes live for years. The operation and follow-up treatments left Ted Kennedy thinner, prone to additional seizures, weak and short on energy, and it hurt his balance. However, Kennedy's tumor had spread by spring 2009, and treatments for it were no longer effective. This information was not disclosed to the public. By June 2009, Ted Kennedy had not cast a Senate vote in 3 months, and his deteriorating physical health had forced him to retreat to Massachusetts, where he underwent another round of chemotherapy. At the end of July 2009, Kennedy was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. However, he could not attend the ceremony to receive this medal and attended a private service, but not the public funeral, when his sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver died at age 88 on August 11, 2009. In his final days, Ted Kennedy was in a wheelchair and had difficulty speaking, but consistently stated that, quote, "I've had a wonderful life." Ted Kennedy died of a brain tumor on August 25, 2009, at his home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, 2 weeks after the death of his sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. In a statement, Kennedy's family thanked everyone who gave him care and support over the last year, and everyone who stood with him for so many years in his tireless march for progress towards justice. Kennedy's funeral procession traveled 70 miles from the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport to the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston, where his corpse lay in repose. Over 50,000 members of the public filed by to pay their respects. And Ted Kennedy's eventual funeral service was attended by a number of famous politicians, including Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Vice President Biden, 3 former vice presidents, 69 senators, many members of the House of Representatives, and several foreign dignitaries. And President Obama delivered the eulogy. Kennedy's remains were then returned to Washington, D.C. and laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery near the graves of his assassinated brothers. There are also a few miscellaneous events that aren't deaths that are related to the Kennedy family curse that are incredibly bizarre. We have to talk about Michael Skokel. In 2002, Michael Skokel, nephew of Robert F. Kennedy's widow, Ethel Kennedy, was convicted of his neighbor Martha Moxley to death during a jealous rage in 1975. Both were 15 at the time of the killing and lived near each other in Greenwich, Connecticut. In 2013, he was granted a new trial and freed on bail. However, 3 years later, prosecutors appealed the decision and the state Supreme Court reinstated Michael Skokel's conviction. Michael Skokel has since asked the court to reconsider and remains free on bail. There's also Edward M. Kennedy Jr., who was an American lawyer and politician. He was a partner at Epstein, Becker & Green and had previously represented Connecticut's 12th State Senate District from 2015 to 2019. In 1973, when he was 12 years old, osteosarcoma was diagnosed in his right leg, or bone cancer. and the leg was surgically removed on November 17, 1973. Additionally, in 1982, his mother, Joan, revealed that Edward missed being aboard Air Florida Flight 90 by just 10 minutes, which crashed into the Potomac River on January 13th of that year, killing many of the people on board. Kennedy had been delayed on the drive to the airport that day and had missed the flight. There's also Patrick Joseph Kennedy. From 1995 to 2011, Patrick served as a Democratic member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Rhode Island's 1st Congressional District and was the first Generation X member of Congress when he took office in 1995. He was a former member of the Opioid and Commission and a co-founder of One Mind, a mental health nonprofit. Kennedy acknowledged having a as a teenager and was treated at a rehabilitation center in 1986. He sought treatment for an in 2006, and due to his experience with addiction, Kennedy advocated against the legalization of recreational marijuana, but still supports it for medical use. On May 4, 2006, Kennedy crashed his automobile into a barricade on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. at 2:45 a.m. A U.S. Capitol police officer said that the congressman had appeared intoxicated when he crashed his car. According to Kennedy, he was disoriented from the prescription medications Ambien and Fernigan. Anonymous sources, however, were alleged to have seen Kennedy drinking at the nearby Hawk and Dove bar prior to the incident. Kennedy also stated to officers that he was late for a vote. However, the last vote of the night had occurred almost 6 hours earlier. The standard field sobriety test was not administered, and Kennedy was driven home by an officer. The next day, Kennedy admitted publicly that he had an addiction to prescription medication and announced he would be readmitting himself to a drug rehabilitation facility at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, where he had sought treatment for his prior addictions. He has since stated that he has no recollection of the car crash. A few days later, he received a show of support when he was endorsed by the Rhode Island Democratic Party. A month after the incident, Kennedy was released from drug rehabilitation, and on June 13, 2006, Kennedy made a deal with prosecutors and pled guilty to a charge of driving under the influence of prescription drugs. He was sentenced to a 1-year probation and a fine of $350. 2 of the 3 charges were dismissed. He was also ordered to attend a rehab program that included weekly urine tests, twice-weekly meetings with a probation officer, near-daily Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and a weekly meeting for recovering addicts. On June 12, 2009, Kennedy announced that he had again entered rehab for an indefinite amount of time at an undisclosed facility. In a statement to the press, Kennedy said that his recovery was a lifelong process and that he would do whatever it takes to preserve his health. I've decided to temporarily step away from my normal routine to ensure that I am being as vigilant as possible in my recovery, he said at the time. As of 2018, Kennedy says that he has been sober for more than 6 years. There's also Joseph P. Kennedy II, the son of former U.S. Senator Robert F. Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy. He's a nephew of former U.S. President JFK and former U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy. Joseph II served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from 1987 to 99, and in 1979 he founded and, until he was elected to the U.S. House, led Citizens Energy Corporation, a nonprofit energy company which provides heating oil to low-income and elderly families in Massachusetts. Joseph had a troubled youth and was expelled from several private schools as a result of his quick temper. He regularly got into fights with his young brothers and male cousins, and he was 15 when his father was assassinated. The night he was shot at the Ambassador Hotel, Kennedy, along with 2 siblings, Kathleen and Robert Jr., were being flown to Los Angeles aboard one of the planes in the Secret Service's presidential fleet. On February 22, 1972, Joseph II was on Lufthansa Flight 649 when it was hijacked. Shortly after the in-flight movie began during the 747's flight from New Delhi to Athens, 5 gunmen seized the jet and forced it to land at Aden International Airport, where all hostages were released the following day. In August 1973, a Jeep he was driving on Nantucket overturned, fracturing a vertebra of his brother David and permanently paralyzing David's girlfriend, Pam Kelly. The police cited Kennedy for reckless driving, and the judge temporarily suspended his driver's license. The Kennedy family paid for Kelly's initial medical treatment and contributed modestly to her car during the years following the accident. I mean, I'm sure that there's more things that we weren't able to dig up or research or find about this whole Kennedy family curse. One thing that I've always thought was really interesting is that Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's, whatever you want to call her, girlfriend, very close friend, partner, the madam of the Epstein girls, the daughter of Robert Maxwell, one of the most kind of evil intelligence connected people ever. There's a lot of evidence that showed that Ghislaine Maxwell had tried her hardest to romance and marry into the Kennedy family in the 1990s, early 2000s. She was like obsessed with the Kennedys and really wanted to get in with them in the 90s. You know, she was trying to extend her influence after moving to New York City. So that's just something to note too. There's ties there to Epstein. Obviously, Robert F. Kennedy, RFK Jr. has ties to Epstein. I'm sure a lot of them did. And in summary, there are quite a lot of Kennedys that died in bizarre ways. In fact, here's a chart that shows their family tree that I thought was particularly interesting that I'm going to place on screen. So, is this entire thing a curse after all? Or just a sequence of incredibly unfortunate, very awful luck? Many have long pondered this, as documented by the news story on the 50th anniversary of JFK's assassination.
John F. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas was far from the first misfortune to befall his family, though it was certainly the most shocking. The young president cut down in his prime. But before JFK even thought of gaining the White House, his parents had already suffered the loss of their first son, who died in World War II, while one of John's sisters, pictured here on the far right, was severely mentally disabled. The presidential couple themselves lost a 2-day-old son just 3 months before John's assassination. While such bad luck may strike many families, the legend of a so-called Kennedy curse really began when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated during the early stages of his own presidential bid.
The idea of a possible curse occurred after Bobby Kennedy died, was killed 5 years after his brother. People thought, how is it possible that this family has suffered so much? Is there some curse?
With the 3 oldest Kennedy sons now dead, the political mantle passed to Edward, known as Ted. As senator for Massachusetts, he was to become a respected elder statesman of US politics, but his presidential chances ended with an event known as the Chappaquiddick incident, which resulted in the death of one of his brother's former campaign workers.
He'd had a few drinks. Toward the end of the party, he left in a car with Mary Jo Kopechne. He took a sharp right turn and went onto a dirt road, went down that road, went off a bridge, and Mary Jo Kopechne was drowned.
In 1999, JFK's only son, John Jr., died in a plane crash at just 38 years old. That left Caroline Kennedy as the only remaining child of the former president. She's recently been appointed ambassador to Japan and cited her father as an inspiration in her Senate confirmation hearing.
I'm conscious of my responsibility to uphold the ideals that he represented: a deep commitment to public service, a more just America, and a more peaceful world.
Caroline is the most prominent member of a family that, despite its many tragedies, remains active on the US political landscape.
In 1969, shortly after the Chappaquiddick Island incident, in which Ted Kennedy lost control of his car and crashed into the water, killing Mary Jo, the media frenzied over his interview on national television. He went on to explain the tragedy, saying, quote, "All kinds of scrambled thoughts went through my mind, including such questions as whether some awful curse did hang all over the Kennedys," end quote. Some historians believe Kennedy's allusion to a curse was a misguided attempt to exculpate himself from responsibility for Mary Jo's death. Mary Jo died because of his actions, not because of any twist of fate. It happened because he was driving late at night under the influence of alcohol. Author Thomas Mayer, who has written extensively about the Kennedy family, said in 2012, Ted Kennedy did not report that incident to the police right away, and the accident is often regarded as being the thing that ruined his future chances to be elected president. Mayer, in his book, went on to say, "The curse is an absurd and deeply offensive myth that has been perpetrated by the media and people trying to explain away circumstances. In fact, the deaths were always, except in the case of John and Robert's assassinations, caused by the actions that deliberately endangered their lives," end quote. Meyer also added that the staying power of the Kennedys' curse stems from the way in which the family seemingly embodied the American dream. The Kennedy story is deeply rooted in the story of America itself. He wrote, "They embody the great American belief that an immigrant can come to America and through hard work and sense of family work their way to the top of society." That legacy, Meyer believes, was solidified by John F. Kennedy's charisma and fate. Quote, "John Kennedy's rhetoric, his appearance, his youth, and the tragic situation in which he died indelibly left its imprint on the American psyche and left people groping for answers. That is part of the reason that he and his family remain powerful figures in the American imagination." End quote. A comment on a Reddit thread stated that back in the old days of Ireland, as the Kennedys were a very traditional Irish Catholic family, the community would take the most likely to succeed, pool money together, and ship the individual to the States. When that individual became successful, they were to send money back to the old village to help. It's been said that the Kennedys didn't keep up with their half of the deal, and that possibly through that action, the Kennedy curse was born. It was also reported that these Irish families were gypsies, and they cursed Joseph Sr. so that all of his sons would die tragically. Edward Klein's The Kennedy Curse, Why Tragedy Has Haunted America's First Family for 150 Years, discussed that the Kennedys had a special thrill-seeking gene. However, in reference to the DRD4 dopamine receptor gene, the evidence was often inconclusive and often contradictory. Quote, researchers have identified a variant of the gene, DRD47R, that is linked directly to thrill-seeking behavior and the propensity for risk-taking. This variant is also linked to those that are ADHD or ADD, end quote. JFK was known to have had ADD. We also know of the Kennedys' history with alcohol consumption, and additionally, rumor had it that Joseph P. Kennedy absolutely hated Jewish people and was actually pro-Nazi. Some people believe that the Kennedy curse began when the patriarch of the family, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., refused Rabbi Aharon Kotler's request to help save European Jews from certain death at the hands of the Nazis in World War II. Some say that Rabbi Kotler asked Kennedy to let in a boat full of Jewish people to the U.S., the SS St. Louis, and that when Kennedy refused, the boat was forced to return to Nazi Europe, where all of the Jews on board died. The story goes that not only did Kennedy refuse to help, but he was rude to the rabbi and publicly humiliated him. The rabbi subsequently, according to this story, cursed the Kennedy clan and stated that his family would suffer from a series of unusual deaths, otherwise known as Misa Mashuna. A Misa Mashuna is the Talmudic term for an unnatural death, a life cut short due to an accident or other unfortunate event, rather than a natural death from old age. Others simply attribute the calamities to the conditions of the Kennedy family life. In his book, The Kennedy Curse Shattered, Les Williams argues that Joe Kennedy's intense parenting style was at fault. Obsessed with power, Joe Kennedy pushed his children to value ruthless ambition and their own exceptionalism, and this could have led to reckless behavior, the accumulation of too many enemies, or a high-pressure environment that didn't allow for anything short of conventional success. A reader on another online forum expanded on this, saying that the family, particularly the boys, were raised with the idea that engaging in risky activities was considered manly. The Kennedy men took a lot of risks, some of which resulted in death or injury. There's only one accidental premature death among the women because they didn't engage in risky activities, and all but one of Joe and Rose's daughters, who are now dead, lived well into their 80s, the exception being Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy. People also believed it was just how the cookie crumbled, that in such a large family, there would obviously be several deaths or other misfortunes over time. However, in 2009, Edward Jr. and his brother Patrick Kennedy told CNN they reject the idea of a family curse. Patrick said, quote, No. Obviously, my dad had a sense of spirituality that transcended his ability to face these problems, in a way that would have otherwise paralyzed the normal person. And Edward Jr. said, the Kennedy family has had to endure these things in a very open way, but our family is just like every other family in America in many ways. Well, y'all, that is the Kennedy family curse. Now, I agree with statements that, could be just some sort of chain of really bizarre natural events. Being in the public eye, being so politically connected and famous would lead to more likelihood of accidents and assassinations. But I know for certain my family is like a huge family, both on my mom's side and my dad's side. And I've never had any sort of defining bizarre accident. Even one would be crazy, let alone the amount of accidents in the Kennedy family and murders, bizarre deaths and cover-ups and everything. So yeah, I really hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. As always, everybody, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to comment your thoughts in the comment section and like the video. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. If you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave me a 5-star review. It helps so much. But yeah, I'm gonna hop off, y'all. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm eager to hear what you guys think about the Kennedy family curse in the comment section. Keep that tinfoil hat on, stay suspicious, and I'll see you guys next week.